Okay, so today we're going to be talking about 100% proof. Jesus didn't think Yahweh was the name of his God. So we're going to be talking about one specific verse in the New Testament that shows that Jesus did not think that his God's name was Yahweh. So let's begin now. One of the main arguments against Islam, the Quran, one of the main arguments against Islam these days is that the Quran, the Prophet Muhammad, and the Prophet Muhammad, etc., never called God by his name Yahweh. So, according to the Bible, one of God's names is Yahweh, one of God's names. God has many other names besides Yahweh in the Bible. For example, one of the names of God is Elohim, Eloha, etc. But we're not going to get into the names of God in this video. We're just going to stick to the Yahweh argument. Well, the problem with Christians who use this argument don't seem to realize that this is the same problem with Jesus. Jesus never called his God by the name of Yahweh, and I can prove it right now. I can prove it in the next slide because you're going to see that there's a very serious problem. Christians have a very serious problems when they accuse the Prophet Muhammad of not saying Yahweh because the New Testament itself never uses that word to name God. And one of the main verses is that I want to concentrate on is Luke chapter 4, verse 17 to 18. It uses the Greek word kurios, as you can see right there, meaning Lord, when recounting how Jesus read Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 to 2 from the Isaiah scroll at the synagogue in Nazareth. Quotations from the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament and the New Testament are generally taken from the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Old Testament, and in all exact New Testament manuscripts, mostly use the word kurios, Lord, rarely the Greek word theos, which is God, never the tetragrammaton itself. The tetragrammaton is the Yahweh or YHWH itself in transcription, such as those Greek letters. So the point is, if you read Luke chapter 4, verse 17 to 18, it uses the Greek word kurios. So when Jesus is reading from Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, he never said Yahweh. He was reading, he read it as Lord. He read it as Lord. So Jesus himself never, even when Jesus was reading the Old Testament, allegedly quoting from the Old Testament, he never used the word Yahweh. So this would have been the perfect time for Jesus to use the word Yahweh if he believed Yahweh was the name of his God. But we can see that even when Jesus is reading the Old Testament in Greek, he never uses the word Yahweh, or in Hebrew, he never uses the word Yahweh. The writers of the New Testament could have very easily translated the Hebrew word to Greek, or the Hebrew word Yahweh into Greek, but they never did when Jesus is quoting the Old Testament. The reason why this is important is because if Jesus had believed his God's name was Yahweh, the New Testament authors, whether they're quoting Jesus, they're quoting the Old Testament, or they're just quoting what Jesus is saying about his God, would have used the Greek transliteration of the Hebrew name Yahweh in Luke chapter 4, verses 17 to 18. So they never did that. The writers of the New Testament never translated the Hebrew word Yahweh into whatever the Greek word for Yahweh is, or they never used a Greek transliteration of the Hebrew name Yahweh. So Yahweh is not Yahweh in Hebrew characters or in Greek characters is not translated or is not put in the New Testament. So the New Testament authors, notice what the New Testament authors were doing here. They had the perfect opportunity, the perfect chance to translate the Hebrew word Yahweh into the Greek word Yahweh or some Greek version of Yahweh, or use a Greek transliteration of Yahweh, but they never did. So this shows that the authors of the New Testament or Jesus himself never thought never believed that his God's name was Yahweh, because the New Testament authors had many chances to translate the Hebrew word Yahweh into Greek, but they never did. And this is particular, even when Jesus is quoting from the Old Testament, they never they never used the word Yahweh. So even when Jesus is reading the Old Testament, he didn't believe that his God's name was Yahweh. The conclusion we can draw here is Jesus did not think Yahweh was the name of his God. If he did so, the writer of the Gospel of Luke would have found a way to Greek transliterate Yahweh in the Gospel of Luke, or use the Hebrew word Yahweh in the Greek manuscript. He never did. So when Jesus is calling on his God, he never uses a personal name for his God, even though he should have, or the New Testament writers had every chance to write it if Jesus really taught that. And even when Jesus is quoting the Old Testament, he doesn't use Yahweh. So Yahweh is definitely not the name of Jesus' God.